Hello and welcome back to the Community Effect Podcast. I am Cindy Robinson and I am so glad you're here today because we're going to be talking about something that sits quietly underneath almost everything that we do as teachers, but we don't always really name it directly, and that's student agency. Before we get into strategies or research or anything like that, I want you to picture something for me for just a moment. Think about a classroom where students walk in and they don't just feel like participants in someone else's plan. They feel like they actually belong to the learning. They're curious, they ask questions, they're leaning into the work instead of resisting it. And not because someone threatened them with consequences or promised them a prize, but because learning actually feels meaningful to them. And if you've ever had that moment in your classroom, or if it only even lasts for a few minutes, I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you've ever looked around your room and thought, why do some students seem so deeply invested while others feel completely disconnected? Then today's conversation might help explain part of that puzzle for you. Because what if the issue isn't motivation? What if the issue is how learning is designed? So, for a long time, education has quietly operated under a pretty powerful assumption that there is something called the average student. And if we design our instruction for the average learner, most kids should be able to find their way through that system. But the truth is that average student, it doesn't actually exist. There's a book called The End of Average, and it's by Todd Rose. And it explores this idea. And in this, he shares a story that completely changed the way I think about learning environments. See, back in the 1940s, the US Air Force was dealing with a serious problem. Pilots were crashing their planes at an alarming rate. And naturally, the first explanation people landed on was pilot error. Maybe the pilots just weren't skilled enough. But one researcher decided to look at the problem from a different angle. Instead of asking what was wrong with the pilots, he asked a different question. What if the problem was the cockpit? Now, at the time, cockpits were designed using the measurements of an average pilot. The idea was if the cockpit fit the average body, it should work for most pilots. So researchers measured thousands of pilots and created the perfect average design. But when they actually compared individual pilots to those measurements, they discovered something shocking. Not a single pilot matched the average dimension, not one, which meant that every pilot flying an aircraft didn't quite fit their body. So the Air Force made a simple but revolutionary change. They redesigned the cockpit so that the pilots could adjust them: seat, height, pedal distance, control, placement. And once pilots could adjust the cockpit to fit them, accidents dropped dramatically. Now, when I first read this story, I remember thinking, wait a minute. Isn't that exactly what we've done in education? We have designed learning environments around the idea of an average student. And then we wonder why some students struggle to fully engage with what we're asking them to do. But here's the interesting part, and this is the moment where I think many teachers quietly recognize something about their own classrooms. If you think about the students who thrive in school, it's often the students who naturally fit the system. They process information in the expected ways. They organize themselves. Um, they move through tasks. They are, pretty efficient. But students who don't fit that design, they often get labeled, and they're labeled as like unmotivated or distracted, disorganized, difficult. When in reality, sometimes the system just wasn't designed for their learning profile. Hmm. And that's where this idea of agency becomes really powerful. Student agency is essentially about giving students the ability to shape their own learning experience. Instead of forcing every learner to move through the same pathways, we begin creating space where students can bring their strengths, their interests, and ways of thinking to the learning process. And when that shift starts to happen, something really interesting changes in the classroom dynamic. Students stop being passengers. They start becoming partners in their learning. And when educators talk about agency, it often shows up through four connected ideas: voice, choice, self direction, and ownership. And the reason these ideas matter is because they build on each other. It usually starts with voice. Voice means that students have real opportunities to share their thinking in ways that influence learning in the environment. Not just answering questions when their hand is called on, but contributing ideas, perspectives, and reflections that shape the classroom conversation. Think about something simple like a morning meeting. When students regularly talk about what they're thinking, they're wondering, or working through, they're not just participating in a routine, they're actually helping build the intellectual culture of that classroom. And once students realize that their ideas are valued, something interesting happens. They begin to expect choice. Now, real choice isn't simply choosing between two different tasks the teacher has already designed. Authentic choice means that students have some influence over how they learn, what they explore, and how they demonstrate that understanding. It might look like a passion project. It might look like different pathways for completing an assignment. It might look like students deciding how to present their thinking. And when students begin to make meaningful choices about their learning, the next layer naturally develops, which is self direction. This is where goal setting becomes powerful. Students begin to identify what they want to improve, what they want to understand more deeply. They also start to plan what they want to create. They monitor their progress and they adjust their strategies when something isn't working. And eventually, over time, that leads to something even deeper: ownership. Students begin to learn, or students begin to see learning as something that they are responsible for shaping. It's something that's not just handed to them. And once students start experiencing that sense of ownership, motivation begins to look very different. Now, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, that sounds great, but my classroom doesn't look like that every day. Well, you're not alone. Let me share a moment from my own teaching that really kind of clarifies this idea for me. I remember one year assigning what I thought was a really solid research project, and I had clear directions, clear expectations, a rubric, all the pieces that teachers are told to include. And when I introduced the assignment, a few students jumped right in, but several others just kind of stared at the paper. Like I had handed them instructions that were written in a different language. One student in a particular, he sat there for a really long time and finally said something that stuck with me. He said, "Can I do my project about something else?" And my first teacher reaction was the typical one, right? I thought, no, this assignment is about this topic. But something made me pause. So I asked him, like, what do you have in mind? And he started to explain an idea that connected to the same concepts that we were studying, but through something that he was generally interested in. And so I said, yeah, go ahead. The difference in his engagement was immediate. The work he produced was deeper than anything he had previously done. And that moment made me realize something really important. Sometimes the shift students need isn't more pressure. Sometimes it's just a different pathway to the learning. Now, Todd Rose describes three principles that help explain why this works. The first is the jaggedness principle, which reminds us that students are not uniformly strong or weak. They have unique combinations of strength and growth areas. The second is context principle, which tells us that students perform differently depending on the environment and the conditions surrounding the learning. And then the third one is pathway principle, which recognizes that there are many ways to reach mastery, not just one. When we begin to design classrooms with those ideas in mind, learning becomes more flexible. Instead of asking students to adapt themselves to a rigid structure, we begin to build learning experiences that allow students to bring their individuality, ooh, that's a big word, into the process. Now, that doesn't mean that we abandon structure or expectations. It simply means that we start asking a different question. Instead of asking, how do I get students to comply to the learning? We begin asking, how do I help students connect to it? And sometimes that shift starts with a very small adjustment, a reflection question, maybe a goal setting routine, a moment where students share what they're curious about, little signals that communicate something powerful to students. Your thinking matters here. Your voice matters here. Your learning belongs to you. And when those signals are consistent, something starts to change. Students begin to see themselves differently inside that learning environment. They stop waiting to be directed and they start participating in the design of their own growth. And that's really the heart of student agency, not control, not chaos, but shared ownership of learning. Because the truth is, students are not averages, they are individuals. They come with their own unique design. And when classrooms are designed with that truth in mind, something remarkable happens. Students don't just comply with the learning, they actually begin to connect with it. And that connection is where real growth begins. So before we wrap up today, if this conversation resonated with you, I would love to invite you to stay connected with this work in a couple of simple ways. First, we just launched our YouTube channel where I'll be sharing additional conversations, teaching insights, and practical strategies that build on what we talk about here on the podcast. If you enjoy listening to the show, I think you're really going to enjoy those deeper conversations there as well. We are also opening the doors to a brand new space for educators. It's called the Community Impact Circle. It is a free membership for teachers who want to keep growing, sharing ideas, and learning alongside each other. Oh, I'm so excited about that one. I'll place the link to that in the show notes so that you can take a look and join us there if you feel like you want to. And if this episode made you think a little bit differently about your classroom, one of the best ways that you can support the podcast is simply by sharing it with or to another educator who might benefit from the conversation. When you like, follow, or share an episode, it helps more teachers find the show and become part of the community. And if no one's told you today, what you do matters and you matter. I'll see you next time on the Community Effect Podcast. Have a great day.